Paradoxes have puzzled philosophers and scientists for centuries. Questions that seem simple but unravel into deeper mysteries. But instead of just explaining them, let's experience them. This is the journey of Elias, a traveler who will encounter many paradoxes, each one introduced through a short tale, pulling us into its mystery before we break it down, piece by piece. From the Ship of Theseus to time travel, from infinity to free will, each chapter will challenge how we see the world. So, are you ready? Elias stood at the edge of the dock, gazing at a magnificent ship that had been anchored in the harbor for as long as he could remember. The townspeople called it the Aegean Star, a vessel that had sailed for generations, but over the years, parts of the ship had worn out. First, a few planks were replaced, then the sails, then the mast, and eventually, even the hull itself. One day, a young shipbuilder named Darius approached Elias and made an astonishing claim. "I have gathered all the original, discarded parts of the Aegean Star and rebuilt the ship exactly as it was. The ship standing before us is a replica, while mine is the true ship." Elias frowned, staring at both ships, one entirely repaired over time, the other restored with the original materials. Which one, he wondered, is the real Aegean Star? The dilemma Elias faces isn't just about a ship. It's a question about identity itself. If something changes gradually, at what point does it stop being what it once was? This isn't just a problem for boats. It applies to people, objects, and even ideas. This is known as the Ship of Theseus Paradox, named after the mythical Greek hero whose legendary ship was preserved in Athens. Over centuries, its wooden planks were replaced one by one. Philosophers began to ask, if every part of a thing is replaced, does it remain the same thing? And if the original parts are reassembled elsewhere, which one is the true original? The paradox challenges the way we think about identity and continuity. We often assume that something remains the same over time, even as it changes. But if we apply strict logic, things get complicated. Imagine you own a grandfather's watch, passed down for generations. Over time, you replace its parts, first the gears, then the face, then the hands. If nothing original remains, is it still your grandfather's watch? Or did it become something else? And what if someone took all the original removed parts and rebuilt the watch? Would that be the true heirloom instead? This is the same question that troubles Elias as he stands before two ships. One was rebuilt piece by piece over time, and the other was reassembled from the original materials. So which one is the real Aegean Star? The Ship of Theseus Paradox applies to real-world situations more often than we realize. 1. The human body. Are you still the same person? Every 7 years, nearly all the cells in your body are replaced. Your bones, skin, and even brain cells regenerate over time. If your body isn't physically the same as it was a decade ago, are you still the same person? It gets even trickier when we consider memories and personality. Your thoughts, opinions, and experiences change constantly. If everything about you is different from when you were a child, are you still the same you as before? 2. Restoring classic art and monuments. Many historical artifacts have been rebuilt piece by piece, raising the same question as the ship. For example, the Eiffel Tower has had most of its iron replaced since it was built. Is it still the original tower? The Sistine Chapel ceiling has undergone extensive restoration. If new layers of paint replace the old ones, is it still Michelangelo's work? 3. Digital identity. Are you the same person online? Think about your social media profile. Over the years, you change your profile picture, bio, posts, and even the way you present yourself. If nothing remains the same as when you first created it, Is it still your profile? The paradox applies in technology as well. Many companies replace all parts of their computers and servers over time. If every part of a company's computer system has been replaced, is it still the same system? Philosophers have debated ways to solve the paradox. Here are three major perspectives. 1. The same form theory, continuity over change. This theory suggests that identity isn't tied to individual parts, but to the overall structure and function. The ship that remained at sea, gradually replacing parts, is still the same ship because it maintained its journey and purpose. For people, this means we stay the same person because our minds and consciousness remain continuous, even if our bodies change. 2. The materialist view. The original parts matter most. This theory argues that objects are defined by their original materials. In this case, the ship that was rebuilt using the original planks is the true Aegean star. By this logic, if we applied it to humans, then once our body replaces all its cells, we are no longer the same person. A disturbing thought. 3. The no true identity view. Identity is an illusion. Some argue that identity is just a convenient story we tell ourselves. Objects, people, and even ideas change so much over time that there is no single fixed true identity. By this reasoning, neither ship is the real one, because the question itself is flawed. Elias steps back, looking at both ships, the one that had been repaired over time and the one rebuilt from the original materials. He realizes there might not be a single answer. But maybe, he thinks, the Aegean star isn't about wood or nails. Maybe it's about the journeys it took, the people who sailed it, and the memories attached to it. He smiles and walks away, leaving the philosophers and shipbuilders to argue over which ship is real. As Elias continues his journey, he arrives at a vast desert. A man stands before an enormous pile of sand, holding a single grain between his fingers. "Tell me," the man asks, "if I remove just one grain, is it still a pile?" Elias hesitated. "It's smaller, but it's still a pile." The philosopher smiled and removed one last grain. "And now?" Elias frowned. It no longer looked like a pile, but he couldn't pinpoint exactly when the change had happened. The philosopher pointed at a fresh mound of sand. "And if I start adding grains one by one, at what point does it become a pile again?" Elias opened his mouth to answer, but no words came out. This puzzle is known as the Sorites Paradox, from the Greek word for heap. It reveals a fundamental problem in language and logic. Where do we draw the line between categories? A pile of sand is still a pile if we remove one grain. But if we repeat this process, when does it stop being a pile? And if we start with just one grain and keep adding, when does it become a pile again? The paradox exposes the problem of vagueness. Many of the words we use don't have clear-cut boundaries. The Sorites Paradox applies to any situation where gradual change leads to a big transformation, but there's no clear dividing point. Think about aging. You don't wake up one day and suddenly feel old, but over decades, the small changes accumulate. When exactly do you become old? The same problem applies to baldness. If someone loses one hair, they aren't bald. If they lose another, they still aren't bald. But at some point, without any clear moment, they become bald. So, does that mean baldness isn't real? That aging doesn't have a true point of transition? The paradox forces us to ask, do vague categories even make sense in a logical world? This paradox isn't just a word game. It affects real-world problems, including law, medicine, and ethics. 1. The legal system. When does something become illegal? Imagine a country with a speed limit of 60 miles per hour. If you drive at 61 miles per hour, are you breaking the law? If the police don't stop you at 61 miles per hour, What about 62 miles per hour? What about 65 miles per hour? There's no sharp boundary between acceptable speeding and breaking the law, yet at some point, enforcement kicks in. A similar issue appears in age laws. Is an 18-year-old truly more mature than someone who is 17 years and 364 days old? The law says yes, but does reality agree? 2. Medicine and diagnosis. When are you sick? Many medical conditions develop gradually. Take diabetes. Your blood sugar rises slowly over time. At what exact point do you officially become diabetic? Or consider mental health. When does sadness become clinical depression? There's no single moment where someone crosses a strict boundary. 3. AI and machine learning. When does AI become human-like? AI gets smarter every year. At what point does an AI stop being a machine and become something more? If an AI writes poetry, has deep conversations, and even forms opinions, is it still just a program? Or is there a moment where it becomes something more? These questions are direct consequences of the Sorites Paradox. We struggle to define categories in an ever-changing world. Philosophers and logicians have tried to resolve the paradox in different ways. 1. The sharp cutoff theory. Even if it's arbitrary, a line exists. Some argue that even if it seems unnatural, there is a precise point where something stops being a pile, or where a person becomes bald. For example, in law, age limits exist even if they feel arbitrary. You can't say for sure that an 18-year-old is smarter than a 17-year-old, but society needs a rule, so we draw a line. 2. The no clear line theory. Some concepts are fundamentally fuzzy. Other philosophers argue that vague concepts are unavoidable. Words like heap, tall, and bald don't have sharp definitions, and that's okay. We rely on context and intuition rather than strict logic. From this perspective, the problem isn't with reality, it's with our language. The degrees of truth theory. It's not all or nothing. Another approach is to replace binary categories with gradual scales. Instead of saying someone is bald or not, we assign a percentage of baldness, e.g. 20% bald, 60% bald, etc. This is how AI and probability-based models approach decision-making. They don't deal in absolutes, but in gradual changes. Elias watched as the wind carried away the last few grains of sand. Maybe the problem, he realized, is that we want simple answers for things that aren't simple. The philosopher nodded. Not everything has a sharp boundary, but that doesn't mean it's meaningless. Elias smiled. Even without a perfect answer, he felt like he understood something deeper about the world. Elias arrived at a grand stadium where a crowd gathered to watch a legendary sprinter race. The runner stood at the starting line, muscles tensed, waiting for the signal. The moment the race began, the sprinter dashed forward. But as Elias watched, something felt wrong. He turned to an old philosopher beside him. "Why does it look like he'll never reach the finish line?" The philosopher smirked. "Because, logically, he never should." Elias frowned. "What do you mean?" The philosopher drew a simple diagram in the dirt. To reach the finish line, he must first reach the halfway point. But before that, he must reach a quarter of the way, and before that, an eighth. No matter how small the distance, there's always another fraction before he gets there. Elias's eyes widened. "But he's moving forward." "Yes," the philosopher said, "but according to reason, he should be stuck forever." This is one of Zeno's paradoxes, ancient puzzles that challenge our understanding of motion, time, and infinity. Zeno of Elias, a Greek philosopher, proposed these paradoxes to argue that motion is an illusion, that logically moving from one place to another is impossible. That may sound absurd, but once you break it down, the paradox is harder to dismiss than it seems. The most famous of Zeno's paradoxes is the dichotomy paradox. It argues that before reaching a destination, you must always cover half the remaining distance first. 1. Suppose you want to walk to a door 10 meters away. 2. First, you must walk halfway there, 5 meters. 3. Then you must walk half of the remaining distance, 2.5 meters. 4. Then half again, 1.25 meters. 5. Then half again, 0.625 meters. This process never stops. There's always another fraction left to walk. If you had to complete infinite steps, how could you ever finish? This same logic applies to the sprinter Elias was watching. If every step contains an infinite number of smaller steps, shouldn't he be stuck in place forever? At first glance, this paradox seems ridiculous. We see things moving all the time. But it points to deeper problems in mathematics, physics, and even how we think about time itself. 1. The Achilles and the tortoise paradox. Speed versus infinity. Zeno's second paradox involves Achilles, the great warrior, and a slow-moving tortoise. The tortoise gets a head start in a race. Achilles runs faster and tries to catch up. But every time Achilles reaches where the tortoise was, the tortoise has moved a little farther ahead. This happens over and over infinitely. By this logic, Achilles should never catch the tortoise, even though we know in reality he easily would. 2. Quantum physics. Is space really continuous? Zeno's paradox suggests that space and time might not be infinitely divisible, that there might be a smallest possible unit of space beyond which further division is impossible. This is exactly what modern physics suggests. According to quantum mechanics, space and time may be made of indivisible quanta at the smallest scales. If so, Zeno's paradox might not be a paradox at all. There could be a point where motion simply jumps forward, rather than dividing infinitely. 3. Computer simulations. Motion in digital worlds. In video games, motion is not truly continuous. It happens in discrete frames, like a flipbook. If a game character moves, the computer calculates their position in small jumps rather than an infinite series of positions. This means computers don't actually solve Zeno's paradox. They just sidestep it by limiting how finely space and time can be divided. Could reality itself work the same way? Philosophers, mathematicians, and physicists have proposed different solutions to Zeno's paradoxes. 1. The mathematical solution, summing infinite steps. The problem with Zeno's logic is that infinity doesn't always mean endless delay. The sum of the distances in the dichotomy paradox forms a well-known infinite series, 1 over 2 plus 1 over 4 plus 1 over 8 plus 1 over 16. Mathematically, this infinite series has a finite sum. It converges to 1. In other words, even though there are infinitely many steps, their total adds up to a finite distance, allowing motion to complete. 2. The smallest unit of space theory, quantum jumps. If space and time aren't infinitely divisible, then Zeno's paradox disappears. Instead of an infinite number of steps, movement happens in tiny jumps, just like frames in a movie. This aligns with modern physics, where scientists propose the Planck length as the smallest possible unit of space. If reality has a smallest unit of distance, then Zeno's paradox simply doesn't apply. 3. The illusion of time. Does motion exist at all? Some philosophers argue that motion is an illusion, and that time is simply a sequence of static moments, like frames in a film reel. This idea, known as the block universe theory, suggests that past, present, and future all exist at once, and our perception of movement is just a trick of consciousness. If true, then Zeno wasn't wrong. Our intuition about motion could be an illusion created by the way we experience time. Elias looked back at the track. The sprinter had, of course, reached the finish line, But the paradox still lingered in his mind. "The world moves," he said, "but the logic says it shouldn't. So which do we trust, our eyes or our reasoning?" The philosopher smiled. "Perhaps both, or neither, Elia." Elias wandered into a dimly lit library filled with ancient scrolls and dusty tomes. At the center of the room sat an old scholar, hunched over a peculiar-looking clockwork device, a contraption of gears and glowing dials. "What is it?" Elias asked. "A time machine," the scholar replied, "and I need your help with an experiment." Elias raised an eyebrow. "What kind of experiment?" The scholar adjusted the dials. "Imagine you travel back in time and meet your grandfather." "Before he ever had children." Elias nodded. "Now," the scholar continued, "what happens if, intentionally or by accident, you prevent him from meeting your grandmother?" Elias frowned. "Then my father would never be born, which means—" His eyes widened. "Which means you were never born," the scholar finished. "But if you were never born, how could you have traveled back in time to change the past?" The machine let out a soft hum. The scholar leaned in. "So tell me, Elias, can you kill your own grandfather before your father was born?" Elias hesitated. It felt like something was impossibly wrong with the idea. This is the grandfather paradox, one of the most famous paradoxes of time travel. It exposes a fundamental contradiction. If time travel to the past is possible, then what happens if you change something that directly affects your own existence? The paradox works like this. 1. You travel back in time and prevent your grandfather from meeting your grandmother. 2. As a result, your father is never born, which means you are never born. 3. But if you were never born, you never existed to go back in time and change the past. 4. Which means your grandfather did meet your grandmother after all, so you were born. This cycle never resolves. It's an impossible loop of contradiction. This paradox highlights a core problem of causality, the idea that causes must come before effects. If you erase your own cause, your grandfather, then you erase the effect, your own existence, which in turn prevents you from erasing your grandfather. This paradox isn't just a sci-fi plot hole. It raises real questions about the nature of time, reality, and free will. 1. Science fiction and pop culture. Time travel gone wrong. Many time travel movies, books, and TV shows explore variations of the grandfather paradox. Back to the Future, 1985. Marty McFly accidentally prevents his parents from falling in love, nearly erasing himself from existence. The Terminator, 1984. A machine is sent back in time to prevent a future rebellion, raising the question, can the future alter the past? Avengers, Endgame, 2019. The characters explicitly avoid changing the past because of paradoxes like this. These stories show how changing the past could destroy the present or create alternate timelines where different versions of history unfold. 2. Physics. Can time travel exist? Some physicists argue that time travel to the past might be impossible precisely because of this paradox. Einstein's theory of relativity suggests that time can bend and slow down, but it doesn't say whether we can actually move backward in time. Some solutions in general relativity, like closed time-like curves, theoretically allow time loops, but if paradoxes like this arise, maybe the laws of physics forbid time travel. 3. The butterfly effect. Small changes, big consequences. Even if you don't erase your grandfather, small actions in the past could still drastically alter the future, a concept known as the butterfly effect. If you step on a single insect in prehistoric times, could it lead to an entirely different evolutionary path for humans? If you say one wrong word in the past, could history take a completely different course? Even without a direct contradiction, changing the past might make the future unrecognizable. So, how do we solve the grandfather paradox? Scientists and philosophers have suggested several possibilities. 1. The Novikov self-consistency principle. The past cannot be changed. One possible resolution is that the past is fixed and cannot be altered. Whatever happened in history already includes the effects of time travelers. If you went back in time to stop your grandfather from meeting your grandmother, something would always prevent you from succeeding. Maybe your gun jams, or you accidentally interfere in a way that causes them to meet instead. This principle, proposed by physicist Igor Novikov, suggests that time is self-consistent, meaning that time-traveling actions always fit into history without contradictions. 2. The multiverse theory. Changing the past creates a new timeline. Another possibility is that every change creates a new parallel universe. If you prevent your grandfather from meeting your grandmother, you don't erase yourself. You just create a separate reality where you were never born. Meanwhile, the original timeline where you were born still exists separately. This idea, inspired by quantum mechanics and the many worlds interpretation, suggests that paradoxes don't break reality, they just branch it into different versions. 3. The Boostrap Paradox. What if the future creates the past? Some paradoxes suggest that time loops could create themselves, without a clear beginning. What if, instead of erasing your grandfather, you go back in time and become your own grandfather? Or, imagine finding an old book, traveling back in time, and giving that book to a famous author, who then writes it. Where did the book really come from? This idea, known as the Bootstrap Paradox, suggests that some events might have no origin. They exist in an eternal loop. Elias stared at the glowing dials of the time machine, his mind spinning. So, can I go back and change the past, or not? He finally asked. The scholar chuckled. That depends. Do you believe time is a straight line, an endless loop, or a branching river? Elias thought about it. If changing the past is impossible, then time is rigid. But if the past can be changed, then reality itself might be splitting into infinite possibilities. One thing was certain: time was far stranger than he had ever imagined. Elias blinked. The library was gone. He now stood in the middle of a grand museum, surrounded by priceless artifacts, ancient scrolls, golden crowns, and relics from civilizations long past. At the center of the room, in a glass case, lay a leather-bound book. A plaque beside it read, "The Lost Manuscript of Elias, Author Unknown." Elias's heart skipped a beat. His name? How? He turned to a curator standing nearby. Who wrote this? The old man smiled. No one knows. The book was discovered 100 years ago. It contains ideas far ahead of its time, mathematical theories, predictions, even details about future inventions. Elias hesitated. The book seemed familiar. Slowly, he reached forward, lifted the glass case, and picked it up. At that moment, everything around him shifted. He was in the past. He stood in a dimly lit study, the book still in his hands. A young scholar sat at a desk, staring in awe. Where did you get that book?" the scholar asked. Elias hesitated. "From the museum, 100 years in the future." The scholar's eyes widened. "A book from the future? Incredible!" He grabbed a quill. "I must copy every word." Elias watched as the scholar rewrote the entire manuscript, word for word. Then it hit him. Wait, if this book came from the museum in my time, but was copied from this moment, who wrote it first? This is the Bootstrap Paradox, a paradox of time travel that breaks our understanding of cause and effect. It describes an object or piece of information that has no true origin. Instead, it exists in a loop, passed between the past and the future without ever being created in the first place. The paradox is named after the phrase, pulling yourself up by your own bootstraps, an impossible action, much like this paradox. Here's how it works. 1. A book appears in a museum in the future. 2. Someone takes it back in time and gives it to a scholar. 3. The scholar copies it word for word, ensuring it exists. 4. Eventually, the book ends up in the same museum where it was first found. So, who actually wrote the book? No one. It was never created. It simply exists in an endless loop. This paradox applies to objects, knowledge, and even people. Imagine meeting an old man who gives you blueprints for a time machine. You build the machine and later travel back in time to give your younger self the same blueprints. But where did the blueprints originate? Though the Boostrap Paradox is a thought experiment, it raises real questions about causality, time, and information. 1. Fiction and pop culture. Time loops in storytelling. Many movies and TV shows explore variations of this paradox. Doctor Who. The Doctor plays Beethoven's music in the past, only to realize he introduced it to Beethoven. Did Beethoven ever compose it? Interstellar. The protagonist receives information from a mysterious force, only to later discover he himself sent it from the future. Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban. Harry survives an attack thanks to a mysterious figure, who later turns out to be himself from the future. These stories highlight how causality gets tangled in time travel. 2. The uncreated idea. Could knowledge be stuck in a time loop? What if a scientist finds an equation from the future and publishes it as their own discovery? If centuries later, someone takes the same equation back in time and gives it to the scientist, who actually discovered it? Could entire scientific breakthroughs, stories, or inventions be caught in a loop with no original creator? 3. Physics and the universe. Could the Big Bang be a Bootstrap paradox? Some scientists speculate that our entire universe might be in a self-contained time loop. The universe expands, then collapses in a big crunch. This leads to a new Big Bang, starting the universe again. The cycle repeats forever. If so, where did the first universe come from? Did it ever have a beginning? Can we solve the Bootstrap paradox? Scientists and philosophers have debated possible explanations. 1. The Novikov self-consistency principle. The loop is unbreakable. One possible resolution is that events in a time loop must always be consistent. You can't change them. If an object or idea enters a loop, it must always exist. You can't break. Elias found himself in a stone-walled courtroom, standing before a judge in heavy robes. The room was silent, except for the rhythmic tapping of the judge's gavel. "Elias," the judge intoned, "you have been sentenced to a test of logic." Elias frowned. "A test?" "You will be executed at noon on a weekday," the judge explained, "but the exact day will be a surprise. You will not know when it happens until the very moment of execution." Elias felt a chill run down his spine. A surprise execution? He clenched his fists. But then an idea struck him. If the execution had to be unexpected, he could outsmart it. "If Friday arrives and I haven't been executed yet," he reasoned aloud, "then it must happen on Friday. But if I already know that, then it won't be a surprise. So Friday is impossible." The judge remained silent. "But if Friday is impossible, then Thursday must be the last possible day. But when I wake up on Thursday, I'll realize that too. So Thursday is alls." Elias's confidence grew. By the same logic, every day becomes impossible, I won't be executed at all." The judge smiled. "We shall see." The guards led Elias away. He spent the next few days completely at ease, knowing his reasoning was flawless. Then, on a quiet Wednesday at noon, when he least expected it, they came for him. As the noose tightened around his neck, a single thought raced through his mind. How did I get this so wrong? This is the unexpected hanging paradox, a famous paradox about logic, predictability, and self-contradiction. It shows how reasoning can undermine itself, leading to conclusions that seem logically sound but end up being wrong in reality. The paradox works like this. 1. A prisoner is told they will be executed on a weekday, but the exact day will be a surprise. 2. The prisoner reasons that Friday is impossible, since if they reach Friday without execution, they'll know it's coming. Since Friday is ruled out, Thursday becomes the last possible day. But that means it's no longer a surprise, so Thursday is also ruled out. By this logic, Wednesday, Tuesday, and Monday also become impossible. The prisoner concludes that they cannot be executed at all. But then, the execution happens anyway, and it's a complete surprise. The prisoner's logic collapses. So, what went wrong? This paradox isn't just a thought experiment. It applies to psychology, probability, and decision-making. 1. Surprise tests and examinations. Imagine a teacher tells their students, "There will be a surprise quiz next week, and you won't know which day until it happens." The students reason that Friday is impossible, since if the quiz hasn't happened by Thursday, they'll know it's coming. Using the same reasoning, they eliminate Thursday, then Wednesday, and so on. They conclude that a quiz can't happen at all. Yet, when the quiz happens on an unexpected day, 2. The stock market. Can you predict the unpredictable? Investors try to predict crashes, but if everyone expects a crash, they sell early, preventing the crash from being unexpected. But if everyone thinks the crash won't happen, the market becomes overconfident, making a sudden crash more likely. Markets behave unexpectedly, just like the execution in the paradox. 3. Military strategy, the element of surprise. If an army expects an ambush at a certain time, they'll be prepared. So, to truly surprise them, the attack must happen when they least expect it. Just like Elias's execution, strategy and surprise rely on breaking expectations, explaining different theories and possible resolutions. Philosophers and logicians have debated ways to resolve this paradox. 1. The prisoner's mistake. Assumptions about surprise. One explanation is that the prisoner assumes too much. He assumes that eliminating Friday means Thursday is the last option. But his mistake is treating each day as separate, rather than recognizing that each elimination changes expectations. The real surprise isn't about Friday. It's that he outsmarts himself. 2. Gödel's incompleteness theorem. Some statements break logic. Mathematician Kurt Gödel proved that some statements in formal systems cannot be proven true or false, just like this paradox. The statement, "You will be executed unexpectedly," breaks logic because its truth depends on how you reason about it. If you believe it's false, it turns out to be true. If you believe it's true, your own reasoning undermines it. This shows that self-referential statements, like "this statement is false," can create logical loops. 3. The real-world answer. People aren't perfect logicians. Another approach is simple. Humans don't think in perfect logic. In real life, people make mistakes, forget their own reasoning, and are caught off guard. The execution is a surprise because the prisoner assumes he was too clever to be wrong. Elias approached the man holding the sign. It was simple, just 2 words, "I am lying." Elias squinted. What does that mean? The man smiled. It means exactly what it says. Elias crossed his arms. All right, so if you're lying, then the sign must be false. But if it's false, that means you're actually telling the truth. The man nodded. Exactly. But if you're telling the truth, then the sign is true, which means you are lying. But that would make it false again. Elias's head started to spin. Truth collapsed into falsehood, and falsehood into truth. It was like a snake eating its own tail. He looked up. The words on the sign blurred and shifted. I am lying. This statement is false. Everything I say is a lie. The words looped endlessly, breaking the very concept of logic. This is the liar paradox, one of the oldest and most mind-bending paradoxes in philosophy. It shows how a simple, self-referential statement, a sentence that talks about itself, can break the very idea of truth and falsity. The liar paradox dates back to ancient Greece, where it was first recorded by the philosopher Eubulides. It works like this. 1. Consider the sentence, this statement is false. 2. If the statement is true, then what it says must be true, so it must be false. 3. But if it's false, then what it says must be false, which means it must actually be true. 4. So is it true or false? Neither. It's a paradox. The problem isn't just a trick of words. It exposes a fundamental flaw in how we define truth itself. This paradox appears in many real-world contexts, from logic and mathematics to computer science and even politics. Self-contradictions in everyday language. We often encounter self-referential contradictions in daily life. First, I always lie. If true, it must be false. Second, ignore this sign. If you follow the instruction, you aren't ignoring it. Third, I am asleep right now. If true, you wouldn't be able to say it. These contradictions aren't just annoying, they highlight the limits of language and meaning. Computer science, the halting problem. In computing, Alan Turing's famous halting problem is essentially a form of the liar paradox. Imagine a program that checks if other programs will ever stop running or loop forever. What happens if we give it a program that asks, will I stop running? If the program says yes, it must stop, making its answer wrong. If it says no, it should keep running, making its answer wrong again. This proved that some problems in computing can never be solved, no matter how powerful computers become. 3. Fake news and political speech. If a politician says, everything the media tells you is a lie, but the media reports that statement, is it true or false? If someone says there is no absolute truth, is that statement absolutely true or false? This paradox shows up in debates about truth, misinformation, and belief systems. So, can we solve the liar paradox? Philosophers, logicians, and scientists have offered different explanations. 1. Hierarchy of truth. Some statements are above others. One approach suggests that we should separate statements about truth into different levels. Level 1. Regular statements, e.g., the sky is blue. Level 2. Statements that talk about truth, e.g., the sky is blue is a true statement. Level 3. Statements about truth. The liar paradox breaks logic because it tries to exist on two levels at once, talking about itself while being judged by itself. 2. Rejecting the law of the excluded middle. Maybe it's neither true nor false. Classical logic says every statement is either true or false, but what if that's wrong? Some philosophers argue that paradoxes like this show that truth is not binary. Instead, some statements might exist in a gray zone between truth and falsehood. This leads to paraconsistent logic, a branch of philosophy where paradoxes are accepted rather than eliminated. 3. Treating the paradox as meaningless, the "it's just nonsense" argument. Another approach is to say, this statement is false doesn't actually say anything meaningful. It's like dividing by zero. It just doesn't work within normal rules of language. Some philosophers say it's a broken sentence that doesn't belong in logical discussion.